Right. So Fuentes and Spencer have had a conversation about the RQ, the Russia question. And I think that both of them are very, very seriously, horribly wrong on that question. It's a really important question. And so I think it's worth talking about it a bit. Here's a clip from Fuentes.
Than relying on Russia, which you're right. I think they're not us. They're Slavic, Asiatic. Maybe be another way to say that. And I regard them very similar to China. It's just like one of these Asian empires, and it has little to do with Europe, at least at this point.
Right. So, yeah, I think that's an extremely serious error. But Spencer, too, is deeply in error. Spencer has just been advocating democratic foreign policy all the way through the Biden years. Remember, Spencer is a man who voted Biden in 2019 very openly, and then he simply advocated for Democrat foreign policy throughout the Biden years. He still has the Ukraine flag in his bio last time I checked. Fuentes' position seems more influenced by classical National Socialism with its errors about the Slavs and Russia being Asiatic. So so he's neither pro-Ukrainian, he says, nor is he pro-Russian. Perhaps his attitude to the Ukrainians too is, well, they're just Slavs. I don't know. But both of these men are committing very serious errors. And the alternative or distant right needs to adopt an attitude which aligns with neither of those men on this very central, important issue. So I want to talk about Russia. The situation is very complex, right? Spencer stresses something correctly. He stresses Russia's deep hostility towards the West and the US, right? Now, this is an important truth, although Spencer turns this into an anti-Russian position, which I think is mistaken. Russia developed a very strong ambivalent identity vis-a-vis the West from the 19th century, okay? So you go back to somebody like Pushkin. Pushkin was pro-Western. Pushkin is just a sort of Russian imitator of Byron, right? He was imitating that sort of liberal romanticism that had taken over Western culture in the early 19th century. And he was performing that in Russia. He was a generally pro-Western figure, right? He was promoting, the idea of Russia becoming more like the West. You think of Peter the Great, right? From Peter the Great's time, Russia was supposed to be on this trajectory of being a Western country, Westernizing culturally, joining Europe, right? Russia saw itself as being European, and they wanted to be like the Europeans, right? Then in the 19th century, of course, you get the development of a Russian identity which is much more anti-Western. So you get Dostoevsky and Tolstoy developing these conceptions of Russia as a different culture, right? And a Russian identity as anti-Western. And so you get, the promotion of everything that's anti-Western, the opposition to, anything that is Western, like liberalism and Catholicism and so on and so forth. Stolypin. Stolypin was a statesman in the reign of Nicholas II, who wanted Russia to develop, on the Western model towards industrialized liberal capitalism, right? But, of course, this developed a very ambivalence at the heart of Russian identity towards the West. In a way, the Russians define themselves by whether they're pro-Western or anti-Western. They define themselves in their relation towards the West. So they know, unconsciously, pre-consciously, consciously, that they are white. They know that they are European, right? They have developed culturally along European lines ever since the time of Peter the Great. They've imitated Western culture. You think of the French-speaking cosmopolitan aristocrats that you encounter in the novels of Tolstoy, for instance, right? But owing to Russia's deep-seated socioeconomic backwardness, I'm talking about the early 20th century here, there has always been a deep misunderstanding of Russia coming from the West, and I think that Fuentes is exemplifying that too. So what we see is that this deep ambivalent attitude towards Russia is nowhere better exemplified than in Hitler, who falsely thought that the Slavs were inferior. Now, Hitler, and I think that this attitude of Hitler's is influencing Fuentes' attitude towards Russia. Yeah, Fuentes talks about the Russians as Asiatic Slavs. This is, National Socialist type language. It's deeply mistaken. So yeah, Hitler had no excuse for making such a bad mistake, making such a serious mistake, because both of his race philosophical masters, Gobineau and Chamberlain, told him that it was not true. Both Gobineau and Chamberlain saw Russians and Slavs more generally as fully European, racially European. We can use the word Aryan, right? Although Chamberlain and Gobineau might not have used that word in the same sense that we use it sometimes. So yeah, in the 19th century, people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and the Pan-Slavists developed the negative pole, right, of this ambivalent attitude that Russia has towards the West. They developed this defensive expression of Thanatos against the West, right, which is one way that Russia performs who it is, right? One way that Russia performs its collective identity. So that's right. And this deeply ambivalent attitude towards the West, and the negative pole of it in particular, of course, continued in important ways into the Soviet period, right? So in the Soviet period, the Soviet Union presented itself as morally superior to the West, right? Yeah, they were anti-capitalist, they were anti-imperialist, they were anti-racist, they were they were against liberalism, of course. The fakeness, they were opposed to the ideological fakeness of liberal democratic ideology in the Soviet period, right? And so again, they're performing this idea of what it is to be Russian as something anti-Western. That's right. These anti-Western currents are still very much alive in Putin's ideology. Putin's ideology has gone back towards the 19th century in some respects, relative to the Soviet period, in that, orthodoxy has again become central to Russian identity. And again, you still have the authoritarianism, which has been a constant in Russian history. And so, Russian identity is still hurt and still resentful about the characterization that has been put on them by Hitler as, Slavic inferiors, Asiatic inferiors, which Fuentes is still promoting. And they're still hurt and resentful because of the way the West has treated them ever since the 19th century at the earliest. So Putin's ideology is anti-fascist in spite of being, in spite of the fact that Putin's regime is de facto a great Russian ethno-nationalist authoritarian state. Okay, so Putin's regime, you could say, is a fascism that structurally misrecognizes itself, and it misrecognizes itself owing to the Russian history that I've been talking about, owing to, it's Hitler's fault, right? Of course, Putin's regime can't recognize itself as a fascist regime because the ideology of the Great Patriotic War is inherently anti-fascist. This is our fault, right? It's the West's fault that Russia has to think of itself like this. So, this resentment, of course, that Russia has towards the West was deepened by the way the West treated Russia since 1990 with NATO expansionism, right? It's deeply naive to think that NATO can just expand indefinitely into Russia's traditional, historically deep-rooted sphere of influence without Russia ever pushing back. And Russia has pushed back, and it has done so effectively. Russia has proved, in fact, that military power, second estate power you might call it, can sometimes be greater than third estate power, economic power, and that's an extremely important development in history. The fact that Russia has shrugged off Western sanctions. The West has been more damaged by anti-Russian sanctions than Russia has, right? So yeah, but yeah, the treatment of Russia ever since 1990 has deepened the negative pole of that ambivalent relationship that Russia has towards the West. So we could and should have done better, right? There is still deep buried in the Russian soul that positive pole of the Russian ambivalence towards the West. The West has been repeatedly responsible for the burying of that positive pole, the eros, right, in Russia's ambivalent relationship with us. And we have been repeatedly responsible for provoking and drawing out the negative pole, the thanatos. It is, the West needs to face up to its role in making Russia anti-Western. It's on us that Russia keeps having to turn to the Thanatos rather than the Eros. We had decades to foster a good relationship after 1990, and we failed. And what was the reason for that? Why did we fail after 1990? It was the smug, sanctimonious, patronizing attitude of egalitarian liberal democracy, right, which cannot respect Putin's Russia, owing to Putin's regime's attitude towards homosexuality and attitude towards authority, for instance. The attitude of Putin's regime towards homosexuality is very commonsensical and rational, very reasonable. They don't persecute homosexuality, but they don't promote it either, right? They don't promote it as something which is just totally cool and every bit as normal as heterosexuality, right? The West, on the other hand, thinks that it is persecuting homosexuality unless it promotes it, right? Unless it treats it as something which is just every bit as normal as heterosexuality. This is foolish. Russia's attitude towards homosexuality is more reasonable than ours. And again, authority. The West just has to have this incredibly sanctimonious, patronizing attitude to any power structure which doesn't conform with the Western model, right? In spite of the fact that Western societies are oligarchic and patently so, right? So liberal democracy is to blame for the deepening of the negative pole of the Thanatos, the negative pole of the ambivalence. We need to turn. We need to develop a positive relationship with Russia. Trump is not going far enough in that direction, in my opinion, though his attitude is certainly far better and more constructive than the attitude of the West towards Russia. There's a lot of deep history that needs to be undone. Russia is not going to turn trusting overnight, but the West urgently needs to try to develop a better relationship with Russia. And unfortunately, that is impossible so long as we remain trapped in the egalitarian liberal democratic paradigm. Yeah, that paradigm simply cannot treat Russia with respect, as we've seen over the past, 30 years or so. Therefore, Europe needs to follow America towards populist authoritarianism in order that we can develop a better relationship with this power, which should be on our side because of racial and cultural deep-rooted sameness, but which we keep pushing away in our stupidity. So it's important to recognize that Spencer is completely wrong in his pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian position, and he's probably complicit with the DNC. It looks as though he's just promoting DNC foreign policy. Whereas Fuentes, as you see, his position is much more America first. I don't know if he's really developed a coherent position on the RQ, on the Russia question yet, but it looks like he's just taking, a National Socialist influence position and completely mistaking the nature of the Slavs. That's an equally serious error. It's very important that we are influenced more by Gobineau and Chamberlain on that question than we are by Hitler, because Hitler was deeply wrong and that was catastrophic, remember? So, of course, we should be anti-Bolshevik and anti-communist, right? But Bolshevism and communism are dead. We shouldn't be anti-Russian. I suggest that the attitude on the RQ, which I have been sketching here, is the one that people on the alternative or distant right need to adopt. So yeah, we need an idea of Europe which is based on ethnicity. We need a concept of Europe that embraces white Americans and also embraces all Slavs, and certainly including Russians.